Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. Our first historical highlight of the week is Mitsuo Fuchida. Fuchida was the leader of the Japanese bomber unit that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He is famous for giving the directive "Tara, Tara, Tara," which is short for the Japanese word for lightning attack. After the war, he read a pamphlet by American Jake DeShazer, who had been interned in a Japanese POW camp but returned to Japan to spread the gospel. DeShazer's pamphlet highlighted Jesus' words on the cross: "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." This struck Fuchida, giving him a new understanding of grace and forgiveness. Fuchida gave his life to Christ on April 14, 1950, and he became a witness as a former Buddhist. Our next historical highlight of the week is Augustine. Augustine is acknowledged as one of the greatest theologians in Christian history. He thought critically about how the church should operate, and he was the first to articulate the doctrine of predestination. He also held the belief that parts of the Apocrypha were scripture, and that church tradition was equally as valuable as scripture, a position the Roman Catholic Church still holds today. Augustine was baptized on April 17, 387 AD. He consistently remembered his depravity before meeting Christ, and this greatly influenced the development of his doctrine. Our final historical highlight of the week, and the subject of our deep dive, is Philip Melanchthon, a lesser-known leader of the Protestant Reformation. Like Martin Luther, Melanchthon was a professor at the University of Wittenberg. He is credited with teaching Luther Greek and encouraging Luther to translate the Bible into German. Melanchthon played a key role in ending division among Protestants after Luther's death. He also authored the Great Augsburg Confession in 1530. Melanchthon died on April 19, 1560. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Scott Keith about Philip Melanchthon.
Well, we've got yet another great guest to help us learn more about Christian history on our This Week in Christian History podcast. And today we are talking with Dr. Scott Keith, who is the executive director at 1517. We'll learn more about what 1517 is as we truck on in our conversation. But we are using today's deep dive to talk about the death date, April 19th, 1560, of Philip Melanchthon, or Melanchthon, or Melanchthon, depending on where you are and which way you want to throw it out there. So a man known by various syllables, but somebody that's not hard to pronounce is Scott Keith. So Dr. Keith, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. Well, we want to learn a little bit more about Philip and about him and about his impact on particularly, I guess, the German Protestant Reformation. And is it fair to say that he's the Robin to Luther's Batman, or is that oversimplifying it?
It's maybe oversimplifying it a little bit, but it makes it relatable and understandable to people, the relationship between them. I mean, I could really nerd out on you in DC Comics and say maybe it's more like the Nightwing to Batman, but that's fine. He definitely was a counterpart of Luther, a colleague of Luther at the University of Wittenberg. It's fair to say that he brought some things to the Lutheran Reformation that would have been absent, save he hadn't been there with Luther. It was an interesting relationship that from the time that they met was lifelong, especially for Luther. Luther dies in 1546, and made that early Lutheran Protestant Reformation what it was, especially when where Melanchthon's concerned in the courts and to the princes, which is something that Luther was not able to do, mostly because of circumstances.
Sure. So tell me about So how did they meet is a great question in my brain. But then also give us a little just of his, kind of his biographical background. How did he get there? He was a student of Luther's, right?
No, he was not a student of Luther's.
Right.
Let me say it this way. If he was a student of Luther's, Luther was a student of his also. And there's a
Gotcha.
real particular way. So Melanchthon is born in 1497. He dies, you said, in 1560. He's younger than Luther. Luther's born in 1483. And so he's younger than Luther by 14 years. And so you also see that where Luther dies about 15 years before him. So they have a very similar lifespan. He's just younger than Luther. Melanchthon is a child prodigy in what we would today, I think, just call the humanities. He was a philologist by training. He was an expert in languages, particularly even from a very early age, Latin and Greek. In fact, his born name is Philip Schwarzerd, which is German for black earth. He's given the name Melanchthon, which is Greek, meaning black earth, and he's given that by his great uncle Reuchlin, who's a famous linguist and humanist. Kind of think of, if you've heard the name, Desiderius Erasmus, who was a famous Greek scholar at the time. Melanchthon's great uncle Reuchlin is sort of famous in the same light as one of the only Hebrew scholars of his time. Also is very good in Greek and Latin as well. And for the people listening, you need to know that one of the early things that makes the early Reformation possible is this idea of the return to the sources from what we call the humanists of the time, where they begin to learn the classics, Aristotle, Plato, Homer, Cicero, and they learn the classics by relearning the languages. So they become experts in Latin and Greek initially, and eventually through people who have to go study with Jewish scholars who are reluctant to teach them Hebrew as well. This is Melanchthon's bread and butter. And he's a child prodigy in this area. I mean, he gets a bachelor's degree by 1512. Again, he's born in 1497. So by 15 years old, he's got a bachelor's degree from the University of Heidelberg, where he studies philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, astrology, Latin, and Greek, and is a top student at the university. By 1516, he has a master's degree from the University of Tübingen. So again, he's born in 1497. So by 19, he has a master's degree there. At Tübingen, he studies philosophy, Latin, Greek, classical literature, law, medicine, mathematics, and a budding field of study that you might be interested in that he really initiates as a modern field of study, and that's history. So he's one of the first people to sort of try to bring formal methodologies to the study of history in the Renaissance and Reformation. After he receives his master's degree from the University of Tübingen, he's at this point known as one of the greatest Greek scholars in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, at 19 years old, he publishes a Greek grammar that is used to teach Greek in German universities for over 100 years. This is how good he is. So how he and Luther meet is Melanchthon is called to be a professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg, where Luther is a professor of theology.
Luther's already there.
He's already there. He's already a doctor of theology. This is 1519, so the big 1517 year, where Luther has written the 95 Theses and posted them on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, has happened 2 years ago. Luther is famous by this point. The only reason Melanchthon goes to this backwater university, which was very much a backwater university, he really wanted to receive a call to the University of Tübingen or the University of Heidelberg, both of which he would have had opportunities at. But his great uncle Reuchlin encouraged him to take the call to Wittenberg, specifically because Luther was there. So that's how they meet. Melanchthon meets Luther. He's captivated by Luther. Is he a student? Not formally, but Luther has a great influence on him theologically. So much so that Melanchthon wants to teach theology. So he and Luther approach the elector and say, hey, can Melanchthon teach theology? The elector says, no, man, he's called here to teach Greek. He's got to stick to Greek. Melanchthon says, that's awesome. I will teach Greek to all these students, and they will learn Greek by reading the book of John in Greek.
Oh, wow.
And so then he gets to start teaching theology by virtue of the fact that if you're teaching students to read the book of the Gospel of John in Greek, you're going to be teaching theology too. And so that's kind of how that rolls there. They work together very closely early on. In fact, Luther attributes his translation of the Bible from initially the New Testament from Greek into a vernacular German, which Luther and the people that helped him translate kind of had to invent that vernacular written German in order to do that. Attributes his ability to do that from Melanchthon helping him to learn Greek well enough that he could do it. He called Philip Melanchthon his master when it was concerned there. And in fact, Luther by that time had been studying some Hebrew, and in return begins to teach Melanchthon Hebrew. But within 2 weeks, Luther writes a letter to one of his good friends saying, this little master, even though I have been his teacher of Hebrew, has within 2 weeks surpassed me and is now teaching me. So he's a prodigy at the end of the day, specifically in this area of what we might call linguistics, language.
Wow. So he's found that sweet spot, right? Or he's understanding his calling and all of that. But he's not a priest, though, is he?
No, he's never ordained in, not even after sort of the Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation would have stopped calling their pastors priests or ordaining them as priests. They would have attempted to call and ordain them as pastors, but not even at that point is he ever receive an official call to a church. Now, within Lutheranism, after the writing of the Augsburg Confession in 1530, the emphasis very much goes to being rightly called over ordained, and so the connection of being a pastor is to the local congregation more so. So Luther is a pastor, a priest in the early evangelical Protestant churches, but he serves a particular congregation. He serves the Castle Church in Wittenberg. Melanchthon's a professor, and he is called to be a professor. They would have had other categories that we don't really have, including a call as a theologian. We have that in universities, but such a thing might have even existed within a church at the time too. So it's hard to call him a layman. People often call him a layman. It's hard to call him a layman, but he was not a parish pastor in the same way that Luther served the Castle Church.
Right. Okay. Well, but just because, and please correct me, don't, one of the things that I enjoy about doing these deep dives is I'm the guy that's learning as much as anybody else. So it's helpful for me about part of that. But Luther didn't always have this kind of a relationship with every person that was, let's just call it quote unquote, on the faculty together, right? Or
No.
that they had the seminary work. I mean, he wasn't always the easiest guy to get along with, right? So
No.
the fact that it must have been, and I'm making a huge assumption here, but it must have been that Luther obviously understands pretty easy early on, this guy knows exactly what he's talking about. He believes the same things that I'm believing. He understands what reform is all about, and his scholarship and his ability are recognized. And I maybe have a respect for him in that, and
Yeah. Oh, that's for sure.
Into a friendship, right?
That's for sure.
Fair? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a lot of ways beyond somebody like Justice Jonas, who was he's a lesser known figure. He's sometimes called the great translator of the Lutheran Reformation because he took a lot of the stuff that these guys would write in Latin and translate it into German and publish it so that everybody could read it. And it's fair to say that Jonas was probably Luther's best friend, if you kind of want to use that category on the friend side. But Melanchthon was an equal as a colleague in many ways. Melanchthon's sort of earliest well-known theological work is something called the Loci Communis Theologici. And that's just Latin for the common topics of theology. It's the first Protestant, in your world, you'd probably call it a systematic theology. In our world, we don't use that terminology as much. We call it a dogmatic same thing, right? Topical theology, going from this topic
Right.
to that topic to this topic to that topic. Melanchthon publishes this in 1521, and it's published based on a series of lectures that he gave in Greek on the Book of Romans. Okay, and that is initially his students write down the lecture notes and they publish it without his permission, and he gets upset, and so he cleans it up and he publishes it in 1521. If nobody's read that, there's two translations of it. One is in the Library of Christian Classics. The other one is published by Concordia Publishing House. I'd recommend either one if you want to get a sense of how early Protestants, quote unquote, did theology. It's the best example you'll ever find. And it's just a 1521 Loci Communis is what it'll be published under.
Okay.
And it's excellent. One of the things that students of theology will automatically note is that he does not start with a typical topic. He does not go from God to creation to sin. He actually just starts like the Book of Romans does with sin, right? And then jumps in, and you eventually end up at the capstone, which is justification, chapter 4 of the Book of Romans, justification, and you go from there as the sort of the center point. I always call it the Loci Communis as a race to Christ, right? And he does that. Now Luther reads this and he writes a letter to one of his good friends, and he says, I am, just to your point, he says, I am rough and boisterous. I go around and I'm pulling up thorns and thistles and making a mess everywhere. And Master Philip comes behind me and he makes neat furrows and plants seeds as God has so aptly prepared him to do. And he says, I would not correct this master of theology, even though I am a doctor of theology and surpass even the great Johann Eck in all my titles. And what he's written here is so good that it should be considered for canonization. In other words, he says, the Loci Communis is so good, we ought to make it one of the books of the Bible. And so that's his respect for Melanchthon.
How about that?
Melanchthon, in return, has a lot of respect for Luther. They never really get into a public row, which is odd for Luther, and even in later life, odd for Melanchthon. Melanchthon does have some areas that he oftentimes laments Luther's rough and boisterous nature, which is and there's times when you can find where Luther says, "Hey, I wish you'd be more bold." Right. So, but if you've ever had a friendship with somebody that's a little more gregarious than you, or you are the more gregarious one and you have a good friend who's a little more humble, you know that is the tension in the relationship with that. Like the humble person always wishes that their sort of loud, obnoxious friend would quiet down a little bit, and the loud, obnoxious friend always wishes that the humble person would just make more assertions. And that's sort of how it went for them too.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Scott Keith on the Center for Christian History website at centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College, in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube Music, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Our next episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.